Warm welcome to everybody to this celebratory event to launch Dr. Asiya Islam's new book, A Woman's Job, Making Middle Lives in New India. And welcome too to our fabulous panel who are here to help us with this celebration. Professor Mary Evans, Dr. Sharmila Parmanand, and Professor Shirin. I'm Professor Clare Hemmings from the Department of Gender Studies, and I'll be chairing this evening. That's why I'm speaking. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers and the book, but to give you the running order, Asiya will speak first for around 15 minutes, and then the panel, around 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A to hear from all of you, and then from 7 p.m. onwards, please join us on the 11th floor of the Pankhurst House in the Towers for a reception to celebrate the book. So, Dr. Asiya Islam is Assistant Professor in Gender Development and Globalization in the Department of Gender Studies at LSE, which she joined this academic year. She studies the relationship between gender and work and is particularly interested in the gendered shaping of the service and emerging digital economy in the Global South, as well as in advancing critical and creative feminist approaches to ethnography. We'll be talking about her extensive ethnographic work for A Woman's Job this evening, but more recently she's been working on the gender-digital divide in India, how women establish work rhythms and worker subjectivities when working from home, which is funded by the British Academy, congratulations, and working lives of women in platform delivery work in Delhi, India, and Buenos Aires, Argentina. So the book that we're launching into the world this evening is A Woman's Job. Everybody who hasn't already seen it, it's a real material object and it feels luxurious. And it's a real pleasure to be discussing this work here tonight against the backdrop of rapid socio-economic change in post-1990s India. Scholars and policymakers have expressed surprise at the low rate of women's participation in the workforce, particularly in urban areas. A Woman's Job presents a unique urban ethnography of young, lower middle class women's lives in Delhi as they weave in and out of service, employment, education and domestic contracts. Urban and educated and skilled, these young women seek employment in cafes, malls, call centres and offices in the globalising landscape of Delhi. Their participation in work enables access to things such as jeans, smartphones, English language and the metro that symbolise global modernity. However, caught in a web of gender, class and caste inequalities, their identification as working women also generates social anxiety. The book shows how women adopt middleness as a strategy of life-making at the multiple sites of work, home and leisure. And it's a remarkably rich ethnography of everyday working life that, as Professor Naila Kabir notes, quote, of the evolving demands of the labour market and enduring gender norms in Indian society. The work is deeply scholarly, rooted in longitudinal ethnography, but it's also lyrical and poetic. Quote, a beautiful play led by intriguing characters, unquote, as Alessandra Messadri puts it, that brings experience of labour and institutional organisation to life. Asiya, in fact, begins the book with a cast of characters in order of appearance, generating excitement and investment in the reader that is sustained throughout the book. Let me just read quickly the first one. You'll already see some of what I mean. So main cast, cast of characters in order of appearance, main cast, Sheila. Sheila was a barista at a cafe, which was her first job. She studied up to class 12 or pre-university level. She wanted to study further, but did not have enough money to enroll in an undergraduate distance learning program, as many of her peers had done. She lived with her parents and 3 younger siblings. Her mother worked as a domestic worker in multiple households while her father was unemployed. And so in this small snippet that introduces your character, you already have intergenerational relations, different navigation of spaces, different understandings of everyday life and affect. And it's that interdisciplinary sensibility in research and representation that I think makes Asiya such a brilliant gender studies scholar, and that reminds me of how lucky we are to have you join us as a colleague in the department. And so, to our panellists, Professor Mary Evans, who will speak after Asiya, has been an academic in UK universities for several decades. Euphemistic. Initially interested in the politics of European literature, that interest was enhanced and developed by engagement with feminist and gendered accounts of fiction. This led to publications on Simone de Beauvoir, Jane Austen, and more recently, detective fiction. Alongside that interest were two other concerns: the changing order of higher education and the cultural mechanisms of austerity politics. In all cases, these interests have been shared with many others and various contexts, and Mary says, thank you to all these people. And I say, no, Mary, thank you for your extraordinary work in the field of gender studies. Mary is famously modest, but actually set up the very first feminist course at the University of Kent in the 1970s. 1980, and has spent her career writing the most extraordinary range of influential texts, and has also been an exceptional mentor. Dr. Parmanand is assistant professor, to my left, is an assistant professor at the London School of Economics in the gender department, and is program director, as many of you will know, in the MSc of the MSc Gender Development and Globalisation. She co-convenes the Women and Development Study Group for the UK Development Studies Association, and is an associate academic at the LSE Seahawk South East Asia Centre, and an editorial member for the Anti-Trafficking Review Journal. She's a PhD in Gender Studies from the University of Cambridge on a Gates Scholarship. Professor Shirin Rai, here to my right, is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at SOAS and a Fellow of the British Academy. Her research interests are in the fields of political economy of development, gender and political institutions and performance and politics. Her recent books include the Oxford Handbook of Politics and Performance and Performing Representation Women Members in the Indian Parliament. She is currently working on a book entitled Doing Politics Sideways, Depletion, the Human Costs of Caring.
No, that's published and you launched it here.
I was going to say, wait, that was the bio.
That was
in my defence, I said, if you'd like your bio changed. But still.
I'm not blaming. I'm just saying.
Oh, God. She has recently published the book Doing Politics Depletion, the Human Costs of Caring.
Which was launched very generously by the department.
By us. By us. I was there.
You were. Just launched too many books.
I know, exactly. Oh, God.
That's enough.
Yes, that's the struggles to reverse depletion, our struggles for a good life, generative of new imaginings of how this work of care, draining and joyful, can be reorganised. So I'd like you just to welcome both Asiya Islam and our panel before we move to Asiya's intervention.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Feels a bit like a party because there's so many people from different parts of my life here. It's amazing to see everyone in one room. The first thing that I really want to say, thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be launching this book as a faculty member at the Department of Gender Studies here at LSE. I mean, that's a thing to be happy about generally, but I'm particularly happy about it because I studied in this department 15 years ago. So even though the book was written and in press before I arrived here in September, actually much of the thinking that appears in this book, the conception of this research project, I do owe it to the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. And it's just wonderful that so many people who taught me are in this room. So thank you very much for being here. Okay, so in turning to the book, what I want to do is rather than dive straight in, I actually want to stay with what's on the outside, the cover of the book. So what you see on the cover are 3 women taking a selfie outside the Select City Mall in South Delhi. This mall serves as the leitmotif for this research, not only because I frequented it a lot for my field work, but because it actually encapsulates the social, cultural, and economic changes in India following the adoption of what was known as LPG policies, liberalization, privatization, globalization in the early 1990s. So once you're inside the mall, you could be anywhere in the world. It houses international apparel and cosmetic brands, multinational food chains, reflecting changing consumption and leisure cultures in urban India. But importantly, it is also a place of work, and indeed a place of work that's quite desirable for lower middle class youth seeking upward mobility on the wave of post-1990 economic growth in India. Now, the women on the cover are not coincidental. In this emerging and expanding service work across malls, cafes, call centers, offices, and high-rise buildings, all sites where I did my field work, where many of my research participants worked, women are increasingly desirable as workers. This feminization of labor in the urban service economy is, of course, not a trend specific to India, although it does have its specificities there that I will return to and that hopefully we can discuss more in the Q&A as well. There's rich scholarship interrogating the new middle class in India, which highlights the discrepancy between the discourse of the successes of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, and the lived realities of those thought to be part of this expanding class category. There's also growing scholarship on expanding educational and work opportunities for women, which reflects on changing ideas of respectable femininities and more broadly gender relations. So in this book, I draw on both those sets of scholarship, but I also importantly bring them together in placing women's participation in the new service economy at the center of class formation. So the young women who feature in this book, and Clare already told you a little bit about them, you heard one of the characters being introduced. The young women who feature in this book can be categorized as new Indian women or modern Indian women. Urban, educated, upwardly mobile, seeking work in the new service economy. But despite their symbolic prominence, we know little about them. As women they're neither working class women driven into work by necessity, nor securely middle class women entering elite professions. And as such, they tend to fall through the cracks. They're somewhere in between, and they describe themselves variously as lower middle class, simply middle, or sometimes in the negative as not high class, not high-fi. Importantly, in contrast to what we know from global North scholarship, they did not see middle class as desirable. Instead, they criticized the middle class as insecure and socially conservative. So I expand on this middleness that emerged with respect to class, but as I argue in the book, it encompasses much more. I expand on this to develop it as the central concept that drives this book. So these women in their early 20s, when I first started this ethnographic research, which was in mid-2016, so it's coming up to almost 8 years now, these women recognized that socioeconomic changes in India had enabled the transition from necessity-driven working class work that their parents had done to the more professional work, at least apparently so, and they were critical of it, as you will hear in a bit when I talk about it, at least apparently so that they have entered on the basis of their educational qualifications. These women had completed schooling and were enrolled in distance learning undergraduate degree programs. They also enrolled in these popular employability skills training programs that taught them how to speak English, how to operate computers, and importantly, how to look the part. Following guidance on how to stand, how to shake hands, and what to wear, the women entered the new service economy. However, their story, and this is an important point that I want to stress and that I indeed stress in the book, is not a simple story of aspirations. They understand the game, but they're not taken in by the game. This is where the concept of middleness comes in. Middleness in the book is not a reference to only their tentative class claims. Instead, I see middleness as a structure of life that women strategically adopt for navigating the opportunities and failures of socioeconomic change of post-1990 India. By thinking through rather than smoothing over this middleness, the book invites the readers to stay with the messiness, ambivalence, and uncertainty that characterizes these young women's lives. So I parse out this middleness in each chapter, taking up things that signal global familiarity like genes and smartphones, and emerging subjectivities to demonstrate women's middling engagements with these. We see that they desire to be fluent in English speaking, but they do not want to be mocked for trying to be English madams. So they choose their moments for speaking English wisely, and indeed they chastise each other if they're speaking English in contexts where they're not necessarily expected to, particularly out of workplaces. They cherish employment for offering them an opportunity to travel on the Delhi metro, on motorbikes and cars, but they worry about being branded fast forward as trying to climb the social ladder in inappropriate ways. So they emphasize the virtue of hard work. They come from middle-class families, but they distance themselves from middle-classness through their behavior and attitudes, emphasizing that while they desire employment, they do so not just for themselves or just only for their welfare, but actually for the welfare of their families. They want to, and indeed they have to, dress as professionals, which in this context often means Western clothing, but they do not want to deceive people about their backgrounds. They do not want to be heroines pretending to be who they're not. They're working, but they quit work to assert agency that is denied to working women. And I thought I'd illustrate this last point that I've made about working by reading a little bit from the book. So Chandni and Chitra were friends and had worked together in the same jobs for a while, but they were both in between jobs when I first met them. As we sat outside the mall, basking in the winter sun, Chitra expressed urgency about the need to secure stable employment. In Chitra's family, resources were stretched. Her father was long-term unemployed because of his visual impairment. Her mother was working in a bank and a few small offices, Chitra told me, doing labor-type work. Her brother was working as a driver, but he did not contribute a regular amount to the family, instead using the money as he wished for drinking. Two of her elder sisters were married and had their own households, but her eldest sister, who lived in a village, had sent her son to live in Delhi with Chitra and her family so he could have better education opportunities. The second sister was, at the time, Chitra told me, a housewife, bringing up two young children, and she said her husband did a job normally, helping out in a shop in Malviya Nagar in South Delhi. In describing the occupations of her family members, and I should say that these are all original use of the terms, so these are English terms that Chitra used to describe these various kinds of work that her family members were involved in. She used various terms for work. Labor-type work to refer to the cleaning work her mother did, normal work to refer to the low-paid work her brother-in-law did, and job to refer to professional service work that she had done in the past. A job, like other things of globalization, has symbolic significance. On the basis of their education, the women rejected becoming housewives and doing labor-type work, instead seeking emerging jobs in the global economy. Chitra also distinguished herself as working from her elder sisters who were both housewives. She added that she now wanted a permanent job, a stable job, in contrast to the ad hoc work that she had been doing for a while. Chitra was also keen on this because she was conscious that in the absence of regular work and studies, her family would pressure her to marry. She wanted to delay discussions about her marriage because she was already in a committed relationship that she feared her family would not approve of because her boyfriend was from a higher caste. Chitra's quest for employment as such was imbricated in relations of familial interdependence, in assertions of autonomy, and in claims to social distinction, particularly through the type of work she was seeking. However, for the most part of my fieldwork, Chitra was in between jobs. She had previously worked in a call center and a cafe, as well as done ad hoc calling and promotions work. But she said, both Chandni and I are roaming around without any job. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't get it, sometimes we get something. A permanent job proved elusive, and eventually Chitra decided to give up on the job search, leaving Chandni alone. Upset with Chitra, Chandni commented, once this love runs out, Chitra will just be another housewife. Inferring that lacking employment, Chitra would naturally get married and get absorbed into domesticity. And yet Chandni had herself quit work several times. When she quit work from the cafe, Prachi, her friend, told me, supportive of Chandni's decision, she asked for time off but was refused. We're not the kind of people who would back down because we only ask for what we should get. What we know is right. How can you expect a person to work for 7 days? Chandni reiterated this sentiment while talking to me later, explaining that managers assumed that their families had financial problems and therefore they were working and willing to be exploited. But they wanted to reject this assumption and confront their managers. Chandni said, just because we are working should not mean they can say whatever they want to us. As women moved in and out of employment, they used the term working as an identifier, not as a verb. Working is a gendered subjectivity in diametric opposition to housewife. Chitra wanted to be working so she could avoid discussion about her impending marriage and domesticity. But working can also be the premise for women's vulnerability and exploitation in the job market. So I hope this helps to illustrate to some extent how these are all relations of interdependence in which women are making these decisions about whether or not to enter work, and actually they enter work but then they also leave it, and this was something that was quite common, and I have seen it throughout the time that I've been doing this research, this fragmented work trajectories where women go into work for a little bit and then might step out of it and then go back into it. So I hope it offers a sense of how women's working lives are enmeshed in the complex dynamics of precarious work, gender, caste, and class relations, and subject formation. In urban India, and again Clare noted this in the introduction that was given, that women's workforce participation rate is estimated to be only around 20%. This unusually low rate has attracted attention and concern, including from international development agencies such as the ILO and UN Women, who advocate for initiatives to encourage women to enter the workforce. It might seem counterintuitive that I've arrived at this mention of a particularly startling statistic towards the end of my introductory remarks, but I do so deliberately, firstly because of my wish to not reproduce the employment empowerment equation in which women are merely subjects and latent workforce, and secondly my motivation to attend to women's everyday lives in which employment is but one strategy of life making alongside education and skills training, leisure practices, and reproductive labor. So the title of the book then, A Woman's Job, is very much a question rather than a statement about what constitutes a woman's job. Returning to the cover then, there are 3 women on the cover, and some of you will already know because I've probably told you before, one of the women is me. The other 2 women on the cover are 2 of my research participants. I know books are commonly seen to be conclusions to research projects, but that has not been the case for me. If anything, the book feels like a beginning. It is deliberately open-ended, including in the conceptual work it does. I have stayed in touch with some of my research participants for the last 8 years. I sent them copies of the book when it came out, and they have been graciously reading it and commenting on it, sending me these images that you can see just highlighting parts that they find particularly interesting or they identify themselves in it, and they've just been sending me all of these messages, which has been absolutely wonderful. So I have felt honored to have the book endorsed by feminist scholars, and even more honored to have the book endorsed by the women I have been working with. So I wanted to end this with statements that 3 of them sent to me that they really wanted me to read out because they can't be here at the event today. So Sunita, she says, a woman's job sheds light on the struggles and triumphs of working women. I feel deeply honored and grateful that the author chose to include my life story in its pages. Reading about my own experiences alongside those of other women felt empowering and emotional. Pooja says, the book really touched me, reminding us of our time and said words which made me embarrassed and laugh too. This book reflects how life actually is these days for people like us. And finally, Chinu says, I talk a lot and everyone listens. It's true, she does talk a lot. Great research participant. But you are the first one who actually listened to everything and remembered it too. You have depicted and explained everything with a lot of clarity. So I know all three of them will watch a recording of this event when it's available, and they really wanted me to read this out, but I also want to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to them, because this research would not have been possible without them at all. So I'll end here. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. I'm very honored to have amazing panelists, Professor Mary Evans, Professor Shirin, Dr. Sharmila Parmanand, to comment on the book, and of course to Professor Clare Hemmings for chairing this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asiya. You really, and that was exactly on time as well, 15 exact minutes, I know. And you're already bringing this to life in a way that I think is really thoughtful and helpful for us. Thank you. And I'm going to pass over to Mary now to...
Shall I go over there?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for your book, Asiya. It was a great pleasure to read it, and thank you as well for the invitation to being here this evening, to be able to talk about it and to share some of my reflections about it. The first thing that I wanted to say about this book is that, and I hope nobody will misinterpret what I'm about to say, but it's actually the first book of ethnography, of sociology, indeed of academic books of any kind, that I've actually thought ought to be filmed. I don't want you to think, do not think by saying this, that I'm suggesting there is a superiority of one kind of genre over another. That is not the case. But in saying what I've just said, I want to highlight how vivid this book is, how it brings to life the experiences, the everyday work, the everyday relationships of the people who are included in it. It's that quality of being there with the people that you are writing about that I think gives this book such an extraordinary strength and a really quite exceptional presence. So, I know as well that Indian cinema has recently turned, in one or two cases, to the examination of the disappointments of the modern and modernity. But I think in this book, and it's what I'm going to come and speak about just very shortly, we're offered a different kind of perspective on what the modern city, urban experience, which is very much what this book is about, can also offer us, not just in terms of individual lives, but in terms of the ways in which we might come to think about a kind of new civic democracy. At an age when I think the more formal forms of democracy are falling apart and not offering us what we might expect them to give us, I want to try and tease out some of the ways in which the relationships which are studied in this book might offer those kinds of developments and changes. So let me turn next to the thing which I wanted to speak about as well in the book, and that's the way in which it engages with the idea of class. Now, in very many academic traditions of the social sciences, class is very often presented as a very static, a very fixed, a very present, it is what it is, and there is nothing much more to be said about it. So people who occupy a class position are often put together in very, very homogeneous forms of association. If you're in that class, you think that, you have that education, you do this, you value this, you look like this, you dress like this, etc., etc. And I think what is actually very, very important about this particular study is the way in which class is actually presented as a fluid form of social relationships. It is not something which you have and then live in throughout your life, not just throughout your life in a sense of chronological age, but the daily ways in which you live. It's quite apparent that all the people in this book, all the wonderful young women that became the subjects of it are doing different kinds of class work at different points in the 24 hours of their existence. So class is not then something that we live in this book, in a kind of rigidity, in a kind of formal set of values and expectations from which we can never escape. There's a multifaceted capacity to class, which I think is hugely important here, and hugely important in what is suggested. So that's the second thing that I wanted to say about it, and from that, to draw out, I think, two themes which come out very, very strongly. First of all, the theme of how class is made, which is something I've just spoken about, but also the theme of what we do with class once we have made it. And we have to think about, I think, of these two things as being related. So it's all very well for these women to put together a position, and they identify with it, they work at it, they want the symbols, the association, the dress that go with it. But what are they going to do with it, having made that situation? How is that class perception, how is that class identity going to take its place in the wider social world? So that's the second thing that I wanted to say here. The other thing, to go back, and the final thing that I want to make about the book, is this issue about the ways in which these women's lives are, I think, perhaps changing something about the ways in which overall urban modern societies might and could work. One of the things that really struck me about reading the individual biographies in this book is that many of the fathers in those cases were unemployed. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just that the women were going to work, they were carrying on those shoulders the responsibility for bringing in income into that family. The traditional providers of family income, household support, were not, it would seem, able any longer to provide that kind of assistance support which had been traditionally expected. So in that context, what exactly is going to change? If you have a family relationship in which those kinds of expectations have disappeared, perhaps only for a short time, but nevertheless not there, what is going to change in terms of those women's perception of themselves, not just individually, but collectively as well? What kind of civic democracy, a civic democracy of greater gender democracy, is being made possible through those changing relationships to the labour market and a perception of the self within it? So those are possibilities for the future. For the time being, what we have in front of us, and what I'm delighted to be able to be here to support today, is this wonderful ethnographic study, this wonderful account, this real engagement with the lives, the lived lives of people. And as I think was very importantly said in Asiya's concluding remarks, the people who were part of this study actually wanted to read it, to talk about it, to consider the kinds of things which they might take from the experience of being subjects in an academic study. I think that's something which I think is very, very rare, and we should celebrate that as much as all the rest of the material in the book today. So thank you very much, Asiya, and thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you so much, Mary. I know I don't need, I sort of feel like I have to lean into this, which I know I don't. No. Yes, please. And as an early career mentor in the department, Asiya, I have to say, don't take less than 5 million for the film rights. Okay, and don't leave the department when you get that cash. Okay, all right. Yeah. So I'm passing over to you, Sharmila. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and big congratulations to Asiya. I am grateful for this space to engage with Asiya's book, which is beautifully written and offers us so much to think about in relation to gender development and globalization. I don't want to go over time, so I'd just like to speak to 3 things that struck me when reading the book. The first was the rich and nuanced ethnography. So, as someone who also does ethnography with interlocutors who experience marginality and precarity, I wrestle with getting the balance right between starting from a place of conscious partiality towards my interlocutors, because I cannot imagine the research being ethical otherwise, while also recognizing that both they and I are shaped by intersecting hierarchies of race, caste, gender, and class that we cannot easily transcend. And I think Asiya navigates this brilliantly in her book. She talks about her interlocutors with grace and intimacy. They are written as complex and sympathetic characters. And as a reader, I found myself rooting for them as they negotiated work, home life, gender norms, and class dynamics amidst socioeconomic shifts and transformations. Yet, Asiya doesn't shy away from acknowledging how the differences between her and her interlocutors may have affected their self-presentations to her, nor from addressing how at times they too might reproduce systems of inequality. The second thing that resonated with me was how the stories of the women in the book demonstrate the instability of the category work and the conceptual and political implications of this instability. Feminist scholars have long been challenging rigid and exclusionary definitions of work, but even as we develop more inclusive and expansive categories, we are continually confronted with people's lived realities that are messy and that are constantly transforming under global capitalism. And these experiences sometimes defy categorization. So Asia's interlocutors were engaged in paid work that straddled varying degrees of formality and informality. Sometimes they combined multiple income-generating activities. Sometimes it was discontinuous. Several of them shunned domestic work and household responsibilities, but they could not always escape these. They provided care for family and friends, and they all performed emotional and physical work to maintain and perhaps improve the status of their families. So conceptually, how do we capture the extent and dynamism of this work? The women's stories also disprove the fairy tale that paid work delivers prosperity, purpose, and social equality. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, depending on one's location in the labor market and the household, and one's self-making strategies and access to friendships and support systems. So the capacious concept of middle lives introduced by Asiya helped make sense of this dynamic space of tension, negotiation, and meaning-making, where her interlocutors navigated structural inequalities and carved out possibilities for change in their lives. So rather than viewing middle lives as a temporary or incomplete stage, we are asked to take seriously the contradictions, ambivalences, and possibilities they hold. So focusing on how young women tell their stories, not as linear progressions towards a fixed goal, but as ongoing negotiations with power, place, and identity, helped me as a reader see middleness as a position of critical engagement with wider socioeconomic structures that shape these women's lives and as part of processes of class formation. Of course, I couldn't help thinking more closely about the section on how women resist exploitation at work. This included experiences of sexual harassment, excessive working hours, unpaid overtime and non-payment for services, verbal abuse from managers, and bullying from colleagues. It is apparent that even at the height of their emotions, their resistance had to be strategic. They pushed back, they looked for other jobs, and some even resigned, but usually only when another family member, a sister, found paid work. This was to minimize the impact on their families. At no point were Asia's interlocutors unaware of the exploitative terms of their work. They knew their employers were taking advantage of their economic position, and they consciously maintained the ability to walk away if certain lines were crossed. So for them, there was a mixture of choice and necessity in their decision to seek paid work, but they would not be economically coerced into accepting certain forms of exploitation. I am curious about the prospects for solidarity in the context of increasingly diverse forms of work, including in what Asiya calls the new service sector, and the expansion of remote work and digital work, as alluded to at the end of the book. There are, of course, shared vulnerabilities and challenges across these work categories. The lack of job security, gendered wage disparities, women being overrepresented in the lower status and lower paying roles, and much more. But collective bargaining is harder because of the diversity and fluidity of the jobs involved. What new organizing strategies might we need to adopt as feminist scholars and activists was something running through my mind as I was reading this. The third thing that stayed with me, and this is very much related to the feminist discomforts Asiya talks about in the book, is the enduring force of respectability in shaping not only the actions of women in her stories, but also their self-perceptions and identities. Some women carefully manage their entry into paid work to avoid undermining the dominant role of their fathers at home, while also using higher status jobs to evade domestic work and distinguish themselves from lower status labor, sometimes performed by their own mothers or lower caste workers. Respectability underpinned the insistence that work was not driven by economic desperation, but by active choice. It also shaped this distancing from immoral or immodest forms of feminized labor, as well as their bodily fashioning. And in some ways also played into the careful balancing act between not being seen as trying too hard or overreaching beyond their class position, while still striving for socioeconomic mobility. This notion of respectability was quite prominent throughout the book, and I found myself grappling with the relationship between respectability and paid work, among a few other things. As the book shows, paid work, especially of a perceived higher status, is a source of dignity and respectability for many women, and understandably so, especially in light of the historical devaluation of feminized work. This is personally and politically significant, and Asiya's writing brilliantly conveys those small and big transformations in their lives, in their families' lives, and how it reconfigures and reshapes gender. However, we also know that work, especially under the current conditions of capitalism, is a site of exploitation and even dehumanization. We also know about the harmful hierarchies in work, some of which have been reconfigured, but overall are still remarkably resilient. And these come through as well in the stories in the book. And the book clarifies to us that, so-called success stories, like claims of universal access to education in India, can be quite misleading when framed as options for social mobility or gender empowerment, when disparities in the quality of accessible education continue to foreclose life options for many. So ultimately, the ideal type that dominates discussions of work, especially in the global north, so this is formal, secure, legally protected waged work, what Asia's interlocutors might refer to as careers or high-status jobs, rather than a labor type work or low-status job, they are more the exception than the norm, and this is increasingly the case everywhere. So grappling with the relationship between paid work and respectability feels like holding several threads at once, which I think Asiya does beautifully in the book, recognizing the significance of paid work for women while also critiquing the very structures that make it necessary for dignity. So still insisting that the idea of work itself has to be interrogated and resisted might also be a problem rather than the solution to inequality that it is often made out to be. And once again, these tensions were evident in the interlocutors' stories, which I found very, very instructive. So all of this is to say that I really enjoyed reading the book. It has made very clear that middle lives are not static. They are always in motion, always becoming. And knowing that Asiya is still in touch with some of her interlocutors, I am also excited to read about the next stages in their journeys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. Are there copies of the book available at the reception? Ah. Damn. Okay, but we've got that code, haven't we, that is up the air. There we go, exactly. So, I mean, I have to say, because any of you that haven't already managed to track down your own copy will surely, emerging out of your presentation and this discussion so far, surely want to grab your copy at its discounted price. So, okay, good, thank you. And thank you so much, Sharmila. And so to pass to Shirin. Yes, please.
Oops.
Oh.
Great book. Endorse it. Thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And I think that's something that everyone has said. So well done, you. Bringing lives to others in very different contexts is not easy. And I must say, I started reading it thinking I'll just flick over it and write something, and I then just got engrossed in these lives. So yeah, you also made me go to places. I'm a Delhi person, grew up in Delhi, but I've never been to, what is it, City Select Mall. And I've not been to Dakshinpuri either. So thank you for all that. And I found this beautifully written. I think everybody has commented on that. Thought-provoking and thoughtful book. So about a section of women we've also said, which is often overlooked in the broad political analysis of Indian women. And I just find it absolutely, it's like a reply to the concerns that have been shown recently about women's labor force participation. Because when I look at their lives and I look at the lives of the women I was invested in my own book, I sometimes wonder, well, why are you surprised that women are not joining the labor force? Conditions of labor are so poor in so many different sectors of work that it is a good starting point, but also, I think, as I said, a reply to those concerns. It's a very particular slice of women, as you have already said, urban, aspirational, employed in precarious and low-paid jobs, enmeshed in familial as well as individual economies of their everyday. They are lower middle-class lives, and there's no getting away from that. And I think what I really liked was also your chapter headings, actually. Very creative, and your cast of characters. I think there are about 19 of them. And I just thought, what a great way of trying to tell us about how class is made, as Mary's already said, but also unmade in the book. So the book not only tells us about their lives, but their dreams and their emerging subjectivities, where madam and ma'am, home and outside, tradition, modernity meet in the making of this concept of middleness. And I'll say a little bit more about that a bit later. A job is obviously, and I think, Sharmila, you started to sort of opened up that conversation. A job is a paid position of regular employment. Now, they don't have regular employment in this. But it's also a way out of poverty, housework, surveillance by the family, boredom, which I love that section, and also a way of improving income and status, meeting people, making friends, and having a romance. This is, of course, also entangled with the wider landscape of social reproduction, which, again, Sharmila was thinking, we could talk a bit more about. And I suspect that your engagement with the concept of social reproduction or care work is particular because of their age. So they're from 19 to 25, I think, or 28 maybe, I can't remember exactly. It's a very particular slice of women's age where they're allowed to dream, where they're allowed to do certain things and not others. And I was always thinking as I was reading the book about my interlocutors who had children and had parents who were frail and they were involved in care work on a regular basis, and thinking how do you get in and out of that work when you have a job, right? So that, I think, everyone has said that we have really, really appreciated your ethnography. And I just think that it's so hard doing that work, right? For any, because you want to empathize, you want to sort of, be their friend, and at the same time, you are sort of standing back and thinking about what the big picture is. The thread of fractured modernity is kept coming back to me, this concept in the context of India, but also many other post-colonial societies. What is it to be modern? And what does that produce in terms of anxieties, but also in terms of aspirations? And where do they clash? And very often, your interlocutors were talking about those tensions quite openly. They like to dress, but then they have to dress in particular ways. They like to put on their jeans, but then they go into the toilet and change their clothes. They don't want to go back home wearing their work clothes because they will be branded as working in low-class jobs. So there's aspiration, there is anxiety, and then they are also, of course, quite aware about sexual harassment, wolf whistles, all that sort of stuff. So, and I think that comes across really beautifully. I also liked your focus on things, the social life of things, whether it is a Badurai or Lato. We think about jeans and tops, we think about smartphones. People's whole lives are, I think, lived in. A colleague of mine just had her phone snatched at a bus stop, and she ran after the person, and then she told me, she said, I felt as if my child had been taken away. I said, well, that's a bit much, but okay. But she said, everything I do is on this phone. Okay. Good to know that some people have, but that idea of things and what do they represent was really well brought out. Working in cafes in City Select Mall is also generative of their understanding of class, right? Or other jobs that they do, obviously. As well as gendered refusals. And I thought that came across to me quite well. The idea, this idea of refusal. So, Emejulu, what's her first name? Akugo. My ex-colleague actually at work. So Akugo Emejulu, she has written beautifully on refusal. And when I was reading that, I was thinking about, okay, but what is the refusal here? And what was striking was that refusal was domesticity at the heart of it. And yet I kept on thinking about how, and you actually read that portion just now, about how does that refusal, what is its travel direction, right? Because I can't remember who said what about, but one of them said, well, she'll just be a housewife. And I've talked to lower middle class women who are housewives, and I think their lives and their social reproductive every day is so much more difficult because of that sense of class and where they are enmeshed and how they are enmeshed. While I very much like the messiness and the textured analysis of the book that emerges from these life stories, I also want to think through a bit more about this idea of middleness and how it is used at different points in the book. At times, you use the term in very straightforward lower middle class means income. However layered the description of lives of these women. These are lower middle class women, but the lower is also shown to be suggestive of a lack of confidence, anxiety about their place in society, and then middleness sometimes seems to me bundles a lot of other characteristics, read off from the social life of things, as I've just said, aspirations, refusal, pronunciation, English, language, therefore. So middleness then is aspirational as well as anxiety-producing confirmation of their economic and social status. But I think all class formations are anxious. So if I think about, again, that thing about fractured modernity, I am so struck by upper middle class women now being really nationalistic and bringing in culture in India as their, to defend and to celebrate. Things that I never grew up with, which is Karwa Chauth, this festival where women sort of have, they fast all day and then they see the moon, and it's all for the husbands. It never ever was a thing in Delhi, in this very town that you're talking about. And now, these are big parties that take place. And these are upper middle class, rich women, and lower, therefore, it all kind of percolates down. So I would suggest that middleness as a sense of between modernity and tradition, between being lower middle class and aspiring to a middleness of middle class, upper middle class, or just middle, or what you call solid middle class. I think I'd like a little bit more on that. I was also thinking, you talked about caste and class and religion. It would be really interesting to hear. There's one sentence that you say in the book about your religion and when they discovered that you are Muslim, or you're not Muslim, but you're culturally Muslim. And so I was curious, and then it just kind of fades away because they don't talk about it and you don't talk about it. And yet Hindutva is like so big now in India. So I was just trying to figure out, did it not play at all in your conversations? And if it did, where does middleness sort of, can they just be, was there a refusal in there about not engaging with or a religion? Overall, I'll just finish now. It took sort of, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. It's just so beautifully written. I just hope, as they encounter marital life, your interlocutors, and become wives and mothers, in a deeply gender unequal society, they do not feel the anger I felt was displayed in another book that I read about women in neoliberal India, which is Nilanjana Bhaumik's The Lies Our Mothers Told Us, where it is all about how you can do everything. And that brings us back to labor force participation under conditions which are totally unequal. And also that the experience of the kind of depletion through social reproduction that Sunita, one of my interlocutors, who is lower middle class, felt when she told me, the stress in the morning, getting children off to school, making food, cleaning the house is great. It is as if I sit in a fast train which only stops when I go to the office. And I think that was something which you brought out beautifully. The office is a space of liberation, despite the fact that, it's precarious, it's tense, they refuse to, it's not very good conditions of work, etc., but it still takes them away from the alleys of Dakshinpur. So thank you very much for that. Well done.
Thank you so much, Shirin. I'm just sat here loving the fact that in the midst of teaching and marking, how great it is that we carve out space to celebrate the research work and the publishing that we do, and also enable each other to participate in such an extraordinarily careful discussion from all of the panelists, because actually, this is really central to who we are, and this is central to what we do as a community, and the marking and teaching is a part of that. But this is where we nurture our souls and keep on having conversations about what each other is doing. And Well, thank you so much for writing this extraordinary book, but thanks to all of us as well for keeping those spaces open for discussion in the midst of the difficulty of being able to do that. So thank you to all of our panelists. Asiya, since, since there were some direct questions and since I'm sure you've got lots of responses and so on, we didn't talk about this, so I don't, you may want to pass, but would you like to respond to anything?
Yeah, I can briefly respond, and then we can take questions. So, thank you so much for reading the book so carefully. There's something great about hearing your own work back and hearing it actually explained so well. So thank you very much for doing that. I just wanted to pick up on a few things. So starting with the points that Mary made, the ways in which these women's lives are changing everything. So I would say that that's a really important part of the book, and particularly the point that you drew out, Mary, which is how they take on responsibility for income for their families, which seems to be contributing towards breakdown of this traditional breadwinner norm. I just wanted to explain a bit more about that because there's so many things that are going on there. Firstly, really in terms of precarity and the kinds of jobs that are there. So we see that their fathers are long-term unemployed. This is a fairly common story with a lot of my research participants. They went into work to often relieve their mothers of domestic work that they had been doing for a long time. So there was all of this going on, and obviously this long-term unemployment doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's something going on in the economy to generate this long-term unemployment, which is then leading to these shifting dynamics in families. Despite this, there was a lot of familial resistance to women entering work. One of my research participants, Jahanvi, and this is also telling you something about how much women wanted to go into work. She said that she stopped eating for 2 days when her father said that she can't go to this work that she had secured for herself in a cafe. He just said, this is not the kind of work that women in our family do. And she said, I cried for 2 days and I stopped eating food for 2 days. So that's how she put up this resistance to that. And then she eventually went into work. And this is, again, this is not a singular story. This was fairly common. And once women went into work and started bringing income to their families, obviously that income was very readily absorbed into the household. So they hardly kept the income to themselves. Most of their income went to their families and was used for household expenses. At the same time, there was this sense that although in many cases they were the main breadwinners in the family, that breadwinner status had somehow to be diminished because you can't be a breadwinner. So there was all of that resistance also within the family that was going on. So a lot of the descriptions that women gave to me about things that they spend money on, they said, well, my family just goes, my money, all of my salary just goes to my mother, and she distributes the money for various expenses, and then I get some pocket money from her to spend on things that I want to spend on. And this pocket money notion was also very common despite them earning full incomes and actually, as I said, in many cases becoming breadwinners for their families. So I think there's a lot of things going on there in those kind of shifting dynamics, but absolutely shows the ways in which women are pushing and kind of shifting some of those boundaries, leading to change kind of on a daily, small basis. On Sharmila's points, I wanted to pick up on the question about prospects for solidarity, because it's a question that I grapple with as well, and I don't really have a good answer to that. So as I said, the women had quite fragmented work trajectories. They were in different kinds of work, cafes, shopping malls, call centers, moved into an office, but they also dropped out of work and would go into skills training, would go into education, might be unemployed for a while another family member is working, so they can take on housework and so on. So there was a lot of that going on, and it's actually quite difficult to figure out where prospects for solidarity are there. The one thing that I've noticed and kind of taken note of in all of these years of knowing them is that there is solidarity through friendship, and I think that's something that you picked up on, Sharmila, and these are friendships that have endured actually beyond the jobs that they might have been doing. So they found each other through the jobs that they went into, but these are friendships that have then endured beyond that. And the solidarity works out in various ways. So some of it is just really sharing resources. I've heard about this job in this place. Would you like to go for it? I can come with you to the interview. But some of it is actually also doing things like going and speaking to one another's families to say, it's not actually important to get married right now, let her work for a while. So they've done that for each other, and I think there's something in there in terms of solidarity practices that are not attached to the workplace. And it's not actually possible to be attached to the workplace because they're not attached to workplaces, right? They're moving from one workplace to another, but also from one kind of activity to another. So that's all I can really say in terms of prospects for solidarity. On Shirin's points, I wanted to respond to two things. One, just the poor labor conditions that you also note, Shirin. I think the conversation around the low female labor force participation rate in India, it's interesting. And I use interesting here as one of those words that you use when you don't want to say worse things about it. But it's interesting in the sense that it's obviously a growing conversation. There's growing concern around how few women there are in the workforce. But at the same time, anything that you read about it, it says it's because of socio-cultural norms. So it's always put into this black box of socio-cultural norms, which just suggests that it has nothing to do with the labor market, with the economy. It's just something privately happening in women's families that's preventing them from going into work. So that's why I say it's interesting. And as your work shows, and then as my work shows as well, that's actually not the case. So they are going into work. They're going into work with so much ambition, so much aspiration, and then they face these really poor labor conditions and poor socioeconomic conditions more broadly that lead to these kinds of fragmented work trajectories. And I wouldn't be surprised if, like Chitra, so we hear about Chitra in the book, Chitra dropped out of the workforce eventually because she couldn't find a permanent job. She had been doing ad hoc jobs here and there, but she came up with a lot of problems with that and she dropped out completely. So I think it's really important also to do these kinds of ethnographic studies as a response to things that we mostly only know through surveys. On the point around middleness, so yes, middleness does appear in many shapes and forms in the book. The reason I insist on middleness is because often when we talk about middleness, whether that's lower middle class or we talk about being in between tradition and modernity, it does seem to suggest a direction of movement. So it seems to suggest that there are people who are between tradition and modernity because modernity is this new thing and we are now going to move towards modernity to some extent. But what I see middleness here is really as an enduring condition. So it's not simply about being between tradition and modernity. It's actually about adopting middleness as a way of navigating fractured modernity, as a way of navigating these aspirations and anxiety that coexist. And I do see this middleness in that sense as much more of an active strategy, something that women are adopting rather than something that they are given or that they're in. So this is why I insist on that middleness and try to stay with middleness. I completely agree with you that in some ways it feels very messy and in some ways it feels very incomplete as well. And it's something that I do continue to think about, but I find value in staying with it to reflect that sense of it being an enduring condition for these women's lives.
Thank you so much. What an amazing set of responses. Did you read those before, or did you? No, right. Thank you so much, everybody on the panel. Let's just have another round of applause because great celebration of Asiya's achievement. So I want to open up now to see if there are comments or questions. Maybe I could get a sense of, I see one over there, I'll come, just want to get a sense of any other, how many questions I'll take. Okay, so there's a few. So in the middle, I see you, and then, yeah, I'll take three.
Yes, thank you so much for this event, for the invitation, and also the discount code, because hearing all of this is really making me want to read it immediately. I'm curious about, I think what Shirin was mentioning at the end, the kind of political climate where this is happening in, and whether the book, I don't know if this is relevant for how you're talking, whether the book situates that within that as well. Are there any conversations happening about that? And specifically thinking about the idea of respectability there an intersectionality happening? Like, for instance, religion, are people showing solidarity, or are they pitting against each other as we are maybe middle, we're not extreme in, or one way or another, we're the kind of like middle India. So just a question about that kind of larger political context.
Thank you. So Anya and Milena, and then I see, but we'll just take the three and Asiya respond, and we'll do another round.
Thank you. Thank you for the book and the contributions. I'm also going to make use of the discount code. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about, the book, from what we're hearing, is quite a lot of dynamism going on in the lives of your participants. And we've heard praise about your careful negotiation of this kind of difficult ethnographic work where you take a subject that's trying to tell you a story, but you also have to do something with that story beyond the subject. And I would like you to maybe say something about the tension between the aspirational and the respectability aspects of it, because with the aspiration there seems to be push for change. Respectability may be this limiting factor, and I was wondering whether that's a boundary struggle for the participants themselves, and whether they veer towards one or another, and if you are not respectable, what is the cause?
Thanks. Elena.
Thank you so much, Asiya. I look forward to reading it. It seems like a beautifully written work. I had two little questions. One is, I was thinking a lot about what was being said about respectability, and I was wondering if maybe the work of Beverly Skeggs was formative in thinking about these formations of class and gender. And then the other question is this middleness. I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about the perceptions of your contributors, about these constitutive others that they are defining themselves against.
Nice overlaps between the questions. And the great thing about it being your book launch is that you can just choose whichever little bits you want to respond to, because this is your celebration. So, what would you like to say?
Thank you for all of those questions. So I will respond to the question around political climate that you also raised, Shirin. So in terms of religion, that's not something that really features in the book or in this ethnography. The set of people I have worked with were, because of the area I was working in, all Hindu women. So it's a fairly kind of uniform religious representation across them. Religion wasn't necessarily a point of study, but of course religion does come up in various ways, right? So even if it's not central, it still comes up. It came up often in questions of marriage. So one of the women who I'm still in touch with is in a relationship with a Muslim man, and she's a Hindu woman, and her family knows about it, but she's pursuing the relationship knowing it's not going to go anywhere. So there are those kinds of stories that do appear where religion does become more pronounced and where women do talk about religion. But I didn't necessarily look at religion in terms of middleness or as a kind of central point of focus in the book. I think in terms of the wider political climate, it is really interesting. And I think when I was doing this fieldwork, well, 2016 is when demonetization happened in India. So for those of you who might not know, in 2016, there was this sudden announcement by the government where certain higher value banknotes went out of commission. And it had a really violent effect on people, in the sense that once that cash was taken out of circulation, there were many people who were unable to afford things that they needed to live everyday life. There were news stories about people dying queuing outside ATMs to withdraw cash and so on. So it was very extreme, and this happened in 2016 when I was in Delhi doing this field work. And one of the things that was really striking was that there was a lot of discussion about how bad demonetization was, and yet when it came to voting, the women mostly talked about voting for the Modi government that was in power and has continued to be in power since then. And that was difficult to navigate, and we have continued to talk about this. It's yeah, it's difficult to navigate is the kind of short answer to it. They've always said, well, you know, we are here, he's still doing something for us. What are other people going to do for us? And therefore, we will vote for the Modi government. I just want to say that this is not uniform across all the women I know, but that's the majority of women I know. So it does very much reflect issues that are obviously very current in India. In terms of my relationship with them, it's also really interesting to reflect on it in this political climate because my name is very obviously Muslim, even though I'm not Muslim. And they only found out my last name when I, towards the end of that first year of doing fieldwork, gave them consent forms to sign. And that had my full name, and that's the first time they noticed my full name and said, oh, you're Muslim, we didn't know you were Muslim. But almost as a kind of endorsement, like you don't come across as Muslim, you're not Muslim in the way we expect Muslims to be. So there's definitely that dynamic at play. I've just not engaged with it, probably mostly for self-preservation, really, in doing this longitudinal ethnographic work. So I think the tension between aspiration and respectability and boundary struggles, I mean, that comes up with everything. And what I found was that in this kind of story of aspirations, which we hear a lot, so the women are aspirational, they're going into this work, and that's also the very, you know, the image of modern India in that sense. But it wasn't necessarily aspiration in a kind of uniform way across their lives at different sites. So what I found was, yes, they are aspirational about going into this particular type of work. To some extent with their peer group, that aspiration is reproduced. But then with the previous generations, with their parents and then neighborhood and wider communities, that actually converts into anxiety where they say, this is not the kind of work anyone in our family has done before. Other people in the neighborhood are saying, we don't know what kind of work your daughter goes to because she comes back at 9 p.m. in the night, and what sort of work is this? So it was really interesting in how that aspiration could quite quickly convert to anxiety depending on who they were interacting with and at what site. And this is why in the book I talk about the different sites. So I talk about work, home, leisure, because there were different kinds of aspirations and anxieties transporting from one to another, but also changing from time to time depending on exactly what was happening within each of those sites. Yes, I do engage with Beverly Skegg's work. One of the things that I've ended up reflecting on quite a lot more, I think actually since the book was published, so it doesn't appear that much in it, is the difference between respectability and honor, and what that difference is and how do we engage with that in this setting. So is it respectability necessarily that we are talking about? I think it is respectability to a certain extent. But I think the concept of honor is actually also really important there, where women talked about izzat, which I see as much more closely linked to honor rather than to respectability. In the way that they talked about it, they said, we don't want to lose izzat, so you don't want to lose honor. It's something that you hold and you don't want to lose it. It does come into conversation with respectability, and I haven't fully kind of parsed it out in the book, but I think they're interesting kind of intersections between them. I think the constitutive others is also a really good question because so much of this was obviously all relational work, right? So when they're talking about class, they're saying the customers who come to this cafe are hi-fi people. We are not hi-fi people. We don't go to cafes to consume. We work at cafes. They said to me, you are hi-fi, we can tell. And I asked, how can you tell that I'm hi-fi? And they said, just the way you talk, the way you dress, what your attitude and behavior is. So all of those things that they took to be symbols of class. And this is why I made the point earlier that actually they don't see being middle class as desirable. They talked about middle class as being quite socially conservative. So middle class families are the families that think that their daughters should not go to work. So that is not a desirable position to be. So they were very much rejecting middle classness in that sense. They sometimes also talked about customers in those terms. So they would say this customer who came in, he was just a very middle class guy because he behaved in this particular manner that we did not like. So that's how they were kind of relating to other people. But I think, and this partly links with the point that Sharmila made, in this relational work, to some extent, they also reproduce inequalities. So often in this work, and they were mostly in the work that I've done, they were reproducing caste inequalities. So in cafes and other offices that they worked in, they would talk about the cleaners who would typically come from low caste backgrounds. They talked about the cleaners in disparaging ways at times. They also importantly distinguished the work that they were doing by contrasting it against the work that the cleaners might be doing, and by refusing to do that work. So it's also just really interesting in how these moments bring out several tensions. There was a particular incident in a cafe where a woman was asked to do cleaning work, and she said, "I'm not going to do it." And to some extent, she resisted that and said no to her manager because she felt like, as a woman, I'm being asked to do this cleaning work. But of course, she also resisted it because she didn't think that it suited her caste station. So there's all of that going on there. They're making some of these gender liberation claims based on actually reproducing those caste inequalities.
There's one question there. Any other questions? There's one too. Okay. So at the front and then behind, and then a little bit further behind. Could you make them very short and only one question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asiya. My question picks up on this last point around honor and status and caste at work. And I was interested in the kind of job hierarchy that you posed from manual labor to a job to a career, and then you threw in like normal work as well. And it's not a very linear type of categorization. There's different types of precarity and different of the categories, and then what might be perceived as educated work within the job category, the career category. The barista job is listed as kind of the job category, which might not be perceived as educated work in other settings. So I was curious what the role of the social construction of skill is, or the way that skills are perceived in this job hierarchy that you laid out, how skills might be undervalued or gendered in particular ways, and that might also shape where women find themselves on this hierarchy of jobs, and social networks as well, the ways that women are connected to different people that might place them at different points on that spectrum. Sorry, that was a very short one.
That was not an example of a short question, but it was very interesting. Thank you. And so two more interventions, questions. Nice and short.
I think I was just wondering about your positionality as a researcher in this specific piece of study, which is coming from two things that you mentioned already. Number one is your identity as a Muslim, your public recognized identity as a Muslim, and also as the way these women saw you as an upper middle class person. First part of my question is that, and the second is your nature of interaction with them, which seems very transparent in a way, because you also say send your book to them later for them to read. So how do both of these things shape and impact your relationship with the research itself and also your participants?
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really good. I think so. I come from Kerala, and where in Kerala it's fairly known to be very progressive in its government, the literacy rates, just women having financial freedom at a much earlier age compared to a lot of other states. But I think the whole oppressive structures, work conditions, not having enough freedom to move around, that still exists at every layer that you just probably portrayed in all your examples, right? So I was wondering, have you had the chance of looking at comparing different kinds of states in the same construct of India? And my second question is,
No, that's it. One question. That's it. Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. I'm saying that because we have 3 minutes. We've had 3 rather complex multi-part questions. And so actually, I think, Asiya, rather than trying to answer them, I mean, maybe you want to make a comment, or respond to one element, perhaps, so that we can still finish by 7. But of course, if you want to come with us up to the reception afterwards, please feel free to follow up or talk to Asiya about other aspects of her work. But pass to you for a last couple of minutes.
For my 2 minutes of comments on everything.
Yeah.
I think I will actually stay with messiness and middleness in responding to all of this. So in thinking about skill, for example, again, this was differently conceptualized at different sites. So they went into computer skills training, but did not actually find jobs that used those computer skills. So that was one of the complaints about, we do all of this training, but actually this is not what we achieve. So there was an aspirational skill, and then that was not really achieved, and they were in jobs that they themselves saw as lower skilled, but actually still higher skilled than what their parents had done. So there was all of that messiness to do with skill in that context. I think nature of transaction with the women, it's going back to what Sharmila actually said in thinking about what I see as ethical research. I didn't see any possibility other than to be completely transparent, other than to actually stay in touch with the women, to send them my book, to communicate to them how I was doing this research, why I was doing it, what I was going to do with the research once it had been done, although it's actually never been done, so it still stays messy in that sense. I haven't myself done comparative studies, but of course there are comparative studies out there that do show kind of differences in different contexts, but also actually similarities across a lot of those different contexts. And what I end up taking away from them is really trying to then think about gender and the force of gender in those socioeconomic settings, really more broadly speaking. But again, I think with doing comparative studies, it can be messy in the sense that you then try and find those points of commonality. Often survey studies do that, which can be problematic in their own way. So I'll probably end with that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for your ongoing engagement. That was great. And thank you, John. Congratulations to Asiya again. And please join us for a drink on the 11th floor of Pankhurst House.